Hey everyone, welcome back to Miniature Painting 101, a series of videos where I teach you all about painting miniatures from start to finish, and everything in between, including the tools you need to get the job done. And this one is working with wet palettes, part 71, where I will just discuss how to use a wet palette. If you want, I can actually create a video in the future on how to create one. So what exactly is a wet palette? That is the million-dollar question of this tutorial. And it is, of course, it's a palette that maintains wet paint. It maintains the paint, allows it to be wet for a very long period of time. Instead of minutes, it could be days, even weeks. They can be found in most art stores. Companies like Privateer Press also produce a fantastic wet palette, or they can be made at home for a pretty good price. They can be a pretty cheap price. Obviously, the next big question is why use a wet palette instead of a normal dry one? First of all, it is unbelievably awesome for mixing and batch painting because you mix a color and it stays like that for a really long time, and you can use this mixture for a bunch of models over a long period of time. And of course, secondly, less waste since it's not drying out. You don't need to actually waste the paint. So here's one from Privateer Press. It's about $15 US, not too expensive, and it comes with a pad of parchment paper, basically. It's basically the consistency of parchment paper, and a large sponge, similar to what you'd find in the containers that models are in. And that's it. That's basically a wet palette. But there's, of course, how to use it. So to start off, add water, of course, to the sponge. So you remove the parchment paper from the package and then just wet the sponge. As you can see, I'm adding a lot of water. The key is you want to get the sponge equally damp throughout the entire sponge. And it's better to add too much water and remove it than have a semi-dry sponge, because then it just won't work and your paint will dry out and it's a waste of a wet palette. So as I said, you want to get tons of water on it, get it equally soaked throughout, and if you find it too soaked, obviously, feel free to rinse out the sponge and dump out the excess water. Next, once you find the good amount of water onto the sponge, it's time to put the parchment paper, the paper on top of it. Now this paper will try to roll up on you, so the two best options are to hold down the corners, as you can see like I'm doing here, and then flip it a couple times. Just reverse it and put it right back onto the paper. That way, if it's equally wet on both sides, that will prevent the curling in the corners. So instead, hold down the corners and then just flip it, and that will essentially fix the problem. And then the next part, the key is you want to get the paper, once again, is equally wet as the sponge. So equal amounts of wetness throughout the paper. And the easiest way to tell what is because when the paper gets wet, it becomes translucent. So you just want to get that transparency in there and make sure it's equally wet across the paper. At this point, it's a good indication of how wet it is. And if you see that there's so much water overflowing because you added too much water, this is a good step that you just want to remove some of the excess water from that, because the water will be maintained a lot in the sponge and on the paper. And I always like to take a shop towel like I'm doing right now and just blot the paper so that it's not soaking wet. You don't want it to be too wet because then the paint will just really get really thin and pool out. So I just like to take a towel and briefly blot the excess water off the paper as well. And now it's completely good to go, and you can use it as a normal palette. There are a couple things you want to consider when using this as a palette. Keep similar paints that you want to mix close, and that's where this wet palette essentially is made for. Those who really like to mix paints, this palette is amazing because it maintains the mixed paint for long periods of time, so you can get a consistent color between a lot of miniatures, as I mentioned earlier. And so keep similar paints close together that you want to mix, because over time they will slightly mix, but keep different colors very far apart on this palette. So for example, if I'm using reds, I'll keep them in one corner, blues I'll keep in a different corner, because if you put them too close, over time they will mix and then you get a purple when you really wanted reds. So as you see here, I'm just constantly using reds to paint up my miniatures, and I'm mixing them as I go as well. As I said, it's going to maintain this mixed consistency for a long time, so if I want to, I can paint a lot of miniatures with the same colors. Put a little black there as well, but only a little bit in case it wants to mix, but it won't be too bad. And that's it. And here's a couple days later, I open up my palette, and this is days later, not minutes. This is literally days later, and as you can see, it did slightly mix, but the paint is still good to go. it maintained a really nice consistency. Now, once again, if you do find your sponge is too wet before you leave, remove the excess water as well. But that's what the beauty is about these wet palettes. I now have this mixed red that is really nice, and it's good to go for another set of miniatures, maintain a consistent appearance. As you can see, it's still wet, and as I said, this is 2 days later, so it's where these wet palettes are really shine, as I said, when you're painting multiple miniatures and you love to mix your paints. So as always, thank you so much for watching this episode of Miniature Painting 101. I really hope you enjoyed it and learned a bit about wet palettes. And stay tuned for next week's episode, part 72, which is just around the corner. But if you don't want to wait for next week, check out The Warp. Click on the link below for a free 14-day trial to my premium YouTube channel, where not only we get to see the next 6 months worth of Miniature Painting 101 episodes, you'll get to see over 60 start to finish painting tutorials, tons of battle reports, face-off episodes, and an Airbrush 101 series. Tons of content. I think you'll love it. So go check out The Warp. So thank you as always for watching. Until next time, this is Jay saying, happy painting, everyone.